Today, we're going to be talking about deep emotional maturity and what that is and how it's different from emotional immaturity. I'm going to be giving you 9 ways to discern where you are on that spectrum and talk a little bit about why it matters and how you can develop that maturity. So, firstly, a couple of things to get out of the way is in a nutshell, emotional maturity has to do with emotional openness and clarity and cleanness in a sense. So it's how cleanly can you discern, acknowledge, express, and feel your emotions without needing to sort of blame or shame yourself or others or manipulate or distort what's going on in some way. And emotional immaturity is much more dirty and distorted. So we can't cleanly discern what we're feeling, acknowledge it, express it in an open way, honest way, or feel those emotions. There's lots of resistance and distortion around all of that. And it's important to understand this is very innocent. Immaturity here, I don't mean it in a bad, pejorative, judgmental sense at all. If we find ourselves doing some of these things, it's because we've been taught, conditioned by, the people we grew up with, that it's unsafe to be really clean and clear about our emotions, right? And there's something we're going to get rejected or told off if we do so. And so we've learned to distort what's going on for us, right? So it's very innocent. It's a survival adaptation, really. And so a consequence of this is that becoming more emotionally mature isn't a cognitive choice. You can't like decide, all right, from now on, I'm just going to be really emotionally mature and be completely clean and clear about my emotions, because there are parts of you that would feel very unsafe for. So they'll stop you from doing it. It's a somatic practice, a body-based practice of feeling into those areas of resistance and tightness and helping them to relax and doing the practices to develop your capacity to be more emotionally vulnerable, honest, and have that capacity in your nervous system to hold these big emotions like anger and sadness, right? So it's a practice, like going to the gym. You just start with some light weights and you build it up over time and lift heavier weights. It's the same here. Also, just before we get going, why does this matter? So if you're living in this more emotionally immature space, you'll find that you feel like a victim because there's a sense that life is happening to you, and these emotions, you're just helplessly living at the effect of these emotions that are coming up and overwhelming you, and you don't like them and you're pushing them away and it's everyone else's fault, and you're projecting them outwards and getting triggered by all these things you're seeing in the world that are your own projection. And generally speaking, your emotions become very destructive in your life. They're harmful towards you and others because these emotions are coming up and you're having to resist them. And then you have to pick up coping mechanisms to deal with that, like addictions, manipulating other people, this kind of thing. And they come out sideways in what Freud called the return of the repressed. Your repressed anger starts, you start lashing out at other people. Your repressed shame makes you kind of arrogant. Your repressed fear makes you kind of macho. You have develop all these compensations, which is a really painful way to live. It's very innocent. We do it, these are all survival adaptations that we take on, but it's a very painful way to live. We also feel very, very fragmented and separate because internally we're very fragmented and separate. Right? We've pushed away all these parts of ourselves and denied them, or we act them out. We push them out into the world, which is the same process, just in reverse. And then we end up feeling a kind of sense of lack and anxiety and fragmentation and separation, disconnect from ourselves and others. Whereas when we step into more emotional maturity, we start to bring these parts we've rejected back into ourselves. We start to feel more whole and we start to benefit from the wisdom of these parts. And so our emotions become much more constructive in our life. They're guiding us in wiser ways to live in better and wiser ways. We're listening to that information. And over time, we feel less and less fragmented and more connected to ourselves and to other people. There's much more intimacy with others and with life. And so it can be one of the most transformative things to develop this emotional maturity. It certainly has been in my life. There's a massive divide in my life between when I didn't know this stuff and I was just an incredibly depressed, angry, nihilistic, raging alcoholic, literally. And now much more peaceful, much more open. My life is better on pretty much every metric. So this stuff is not, this is important stuff. It's not some side issue. With that said, let's jump in. So here are the 9 sort of angles you can assess your kind of emotional maturity. Number one is whether you take responsibility and ownership for your emotions. So the immature perspective here tends to see the cause of emotions as being outside themselves. And as a result, they don't take ownership. It's like, oh, that person really pissed me off. So they're responsible for the fact that I'm angry, right? And this means that we kind of can't do anything about our emotions. We're a victim of the world, and we try and manipulate and change the world in ways that don't really help us in the long term. The more mature perspective is to take responsibility and ownership for what's on our side of the street. So maybe the wounds within us um, that are being triggered, because we recognize that although the trigger is external, so maybe someone is being, behaving in some way we find obnoxious, and that's triggering something up in us. That trigger is external, but the cause is within us. It's internal. Now, I don't want to take this too far. There are some people take it very far. It's like it's completely what's within you, and what happens in the outside world doesn't matter at all. That's not the case. Sometimes people can act in very harmful ways, and you need to address that and deal with that. But if you acknowledge what's going on within you and take responsibility and ownership for it, you're much less of a victim, and you can actually start to take responsibility and process and integrate some of those wounds, and then you can, deal with that reactivity within you better, right? So this is really foundational. None of the rest of emotional maturity will work unless you take ownership for what's on your side of the street. The second one is how you view your emotions. So the immature perspective views emotions as essentially bad and wrong. If you're having a painful emotion, it means that something has gone wrong and it shouldn't be this way, and that you need to get rid of that emotion and fix it and change. And this embodies kind of resistance to our emotions, which only makes them hold on even more tightly, right? We're resisting our anxiety and our anger and our shame, and we just push it down, and it just gets even more embedded into our unconscious and our life. The more mature perspective recognizes, okay, emotions can be painful, but they're here for a reason. They're trying to communicate something to us, right? So there's an attitude of curiosity and respect and listening. It's like there's some wound we haven't addressed from the past, or the emotion is communicating, maybe we need to behave differently in the present moment. Our shame is saying, okay, maybe you've done something you shouldn't have done. Our fear is saying, maybe there's something you haven't, you need to watch out for here. You don't want to just go in all guns blazing. Our anger is saying, maybe your boundaries are being violated here. Maybe you need to stand up for yourself in some way, right? And it's really important that we want to listen. That's our deep intuition and intelligence. We need to have contact that to have like a deep, fulfilling, happy life. We need to be connected to our own wisdom and ourselves. The third one is whether we can distinguish between an emotion and the behavior associated with that emotion. So the immature perspective thinks these are the same thing. It conflates them. So for a person who's more immature here, they'll think that feeling anger is the same as acting angrily and being aggressive. So it's the same as yelling and shouting and pushing someone away. And that means that it means it's impossible from that perspective to feel an emotion in a healthy way, because it's like the only option you have is either nothing or yelling and kicking and screaming in the context of the example of anger here, right? And so it's like, well, I don't want to yell and scream and kick, so I'm gonna repress this anger, because there's no other option. They can't distinguish between just feeling the emotion and the behavior. That's the mature perspective. You're like, okay, there's this feeling of emotion of anger here. I can feel the anger in my chest. It's vibrating, it's tingling with heat. But that doesn't mean, that's not the same as acting that out and expressing that anger through aggression or whatever else, right? And that means we have space to feel that emotion and listen to it, contain it, but without having to harm others with that certain behaviors, right? Or ourselves. So the fourth one is what emotions mean about who we are, whether we have an identity attached to them. So the immature perspective here feels like emotions mean something in a very fundamental and absolute sense about who we are. So maybe if we feel sadness, that means if the sadness is present in my system, that might say to someone, oh, I'm weak. And they don't want to be weak, so they have to push the sadness away. Or if they feel fear, that means that I'm a coward. If I'm feeling any fear, that means I'm a coward. They have to push that away. Maybe they don't want to be, an angry, aggressive person. They're like, I'm a really nice person. If anger's here, that means I'm a horrible, angry person. I can't be that, right? So this identity prevents us from feeling that emotion. It can go the other way as well, where someone's over-identified with anger. It's like, I'm just a really direct person. You ever met someone like that? That's just who I am. I'm just a really direct person, which gives them license to act out their anger. Because if you complain to them, they just go, "Oh, that's just who I am." I'm just a really direct person, and they're using that as a plausible deniability because they're not taking ownership or responsibility for their anger to deal with it in a healthy way. They're harming you and putting it on you, and then using an identity to like weasel their way out. You know what I mean? Very frustrating to deal with people like that. Whereas the more mature perspective, emotions don't necessarily mean anything about who we are. So if we're feeling sadness, that doesn't necessarily mean we're weak. It just means there's sadness here. Or if we're feeling fear, doesn't necessarily mean we're a coward. There's space for the relativity and dynamism for emotions. We recognize all these emotions come and go all the time, and it doesn't say anything fundamentally about who we are. Um, which again, that gives us much more leeway to just like feel whatever's there without having to distort it, deny it, or like over identify with it and not deal with it through that extreme. Number five is, how we relate and what we do with our emotions. So the immature perspective deals with emotions in one of two ways. Some painful emotion comes up, it's either repressing it, denying it, distracting from it, numbing out to it, watching TV, smoking weed, or just certain emotions we repress by feeling another emotion. So anger might come up and we might burst into tears instead. That's a way of repressing the anger. Or the other way is that we act out those emotions. So if anger comes up, rather than feeling it, we project it outwards. So we lash out at the world and at other people, right? Or if we're feeling fear, we might be very arrogant, act out in that way. That's a way of coping with the fear in an indirect way, by compensating with a lot of arrogance. Or if we're feeling sad, we might just go partying all the time, right? And just we're super positive, we're super fun, we're doing all the cool things, right? It's a way of acting out. And there are many ways that we do that. The the issue with this is we're never really meeting the emotion itself, right? If we're repressing it, it's pushing it away. And if we're acting it out, it's kind of pushing it away, but in a different sense. Rather than pushing it inwards, you're pushing it outwards into the world, is kind of what you're doing with that. Your focus is not on your internal world, but what's going on outside you. The more mature perspective is that we don't repress it and we don't act it out. There's the middle way of like just feeling and containing that emotion. So we're with our own internal experience, we're feeling it, we're listening to it, we're acknowledging it. And that's how we process and integrate our emotions. It's through that middle way, is the way that is how you heal and how you process your emotions. And that's what leads to greater sense of wholeness, right? The immature perspective here of pushing the emotions away leads to a lot of inner fragmentation because we're feeling isolated. Well, we are literally isolating and pushing away these different parts of ourselves. So the sixth one is, are you in your head or are you in your body? So the immature perspective here is much more in the head and sort of with the outer world and the narratives and the stories around the emotions. Now, then they're not, the narratives and stories are not invalid, but we don't want to massively overemphasize them at the cost of the emotion itself. And so when we're in the head, when we're stuck in like he said, she said, and trying to figure out like who's right and who's wrong, and did she mean this or did she mean that? That's all a way of escaping. It's a strategy to escape from the painful feelings in the body, right? So we end up not feeling our emotions, and through that process, we're really just resisting and repressing our emotions, which means that they, get stuck we push them down back into the unconscious, and they start coming out sideways uh, in our lives in unpleasant ways. The mature perspective is that we are much more embodied, much more present with the sensations of the feelings in our body. So this could be the fear in the belly, or the sadness in the chest, the anger in the shoulders. When we're feeling these emotions, our attention is in the body, really present with it, listening and moving, feeling through that emotion, which is what helps it to process through. You can't process an emotion without feeling it. We feel it to heal it. It's very simple, but it's the bottom line here. The seventh point is whether or not you can express the truth of your emotions vulnerably and cleanly without shaming or blaming yourself or other people. So the immature perspective here finds it very difficult. And again, for entirely innocent reasons, because we were taught that it's unsafe to be clean and clear, finds it very difficult to state the truth plainly. Instead, we tend to manipulate or snipe or blame or shame. So rather than saying, "Oh, you turned up really late to our meeting, and that actually that makes me feel quite hurt and quite angry," is what I'm feeling right now. You'll say something like, "Well, I can't believe, I can't believe you turned up so late." You're not being vulnerable and saying what you're feeling. You're kind of trying to hurt the other person, put them on the back foot, and trying to make them sort of admit something, and make them admit that they were wrong or something like that. It's like, "Oh, I can't believe you did that." Or it'll come out sideways in some other context. You'll be in a WhatsApp group with some friends, that same friend who was late, like organizing some event, right? And you'll be like, "Oh, well, tell Sarah to come an hour early." Ha 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 ha. The implication, again, it's this passive aggressive sniping or something like that, where rather than saying like, "I was hurt by the fact that Sarah didn't turn up on time because it made me feel like she doesn't respect me or listen to me," you try and hurt her to change her behavior, right? The more mature perspective can express the truth more cleanly. There's You're just simply honest, right? And the big trap here is trying to rationalize your feelings. So it's important to understand that you don't get to choose how you're feeling. You only get to choose whether you're honest about it or not. So a lot of people, feel anger and they go, "Oh, well, I shouldn't be angry at that person because, they've got a lot going on now. And, they just had a kid, and I totally understand that they're super busy. And so if they turned up late, I totally understand that." But in rationalizing it, that they're denying the fact that they simply feel angry. Whether it's justified or not is not the point. It's here. And so it needs to be acknowledged as such, right? Um, so we're after the truth of what's here, not how appropriate it is or how justified it is, right? You are how you are, and this doesn't mean you have to, if you're feeling angry and your anger is inappropriate in some way, that doesn't mean you have to, you can still be reasonable and not take it out on the other person, but you still have to acknowledge that you're angry, even if it's unreasonable, so that you can deal with it, so you can take responsibility and ownership for what's going on with you. The eighth point is, do you think your emotions represent the absolute truth, or are they just a relative perspective? So the immature perspective here tends not to acknowledge the multiplicity of a human being. We're made of many, many, many parts, which are often contradictory and, banging against each other. So we can love someone. There's a part of us that loves someone. There's a part of us that hates that same person. There's a part of us that likes to do our job, and there's a part of us that doesn't like to do our job. Um, and when we're immature, we find it very difficult to recognize that all these different parts of us are just a perspective. We treat each one as like the absolute truth, which means sometimes we have to deny the other parts. So if, say, I over-identify with this part, like, "Oh, I love my partner," then if there's any resentment or anger towards them at something they might have done, we have to deny that because it doesn't fit with that identification with the absolute truth of, "Oh, I love this person." So there's no space for different perspectives and parts, either within yourself or for other people. So you end up very one-dimensional with yourself, and you end up also not being able to understand other people, because if you want to resolve a conflict with someone, you have to inhabit their perspective, you have to understand their perspective. And if you think your perspective is the absolute truth, then that means by definition that any other perspective is false and wrong, and you're going to act that way, right? So you're never going to be able to inhabit someone else's perspectives. And so you can have a lot of conflict in your life and a lot of of battling against other people. Right. And they're not going to feel, no one in your life is going to feel understood by you. And that's going to be very painful. The mature perspective here acknowledges this multiplicity of ourselves. And so we validate the narrative and perspective of each part without taking it as the absolute truth. So there's space for these different perspectives. So I can have my perspective of like, well, I'm upset that a part of me is upset and angry that you turned up late. And then that other person can have like, I appreciate that, but I'm I just had a baby. My grandmother is in hospital. Uh, I'm feeling a huge amount of overwhelm. And you can both understand that. It's like, oh yeah, I felt overwhelmed before. I understand that, when you're really overwhelmed, things like turning up on time seem less important. And that other person can be like, yeah, I've had the experience of people turning up late before. It wasn't very nice. In this way, you find, you can resolve your conflicts, right? Number nine, the final one, and this is a biggie, is are you aware of the ways in which you resist and repress emotion? So we're all repressing vast reservoirs of emotions, many childhood wounds, and most people are completely unaware that this is the case. And so this immature perspective here is this assumption that if you don't feel something, then it isn't there. Because people don't really know how emotions work. They don't know that you've got this backlog of emotions stored in your unconscious in the body that are getting triggered up by the events of life. And so if you ask them, are you repressing huge amounts of rage? They go, no, what are you talking about? But the fact is that if you dig into it, you'll find that you are. Every human being in our society has been, we live in a traumatizing society, quite frankly. The way we're brought up is just not what a human being needs. And so we inevitably pick up these wounds. And if you can't acknowledge that something's there, there's no way of dealing with it. You can't take responsibility and ownership for this stuff, which is the first step, right? Whereas the more mature perspective is that we become more conscious of these myriad hundreds of ways in which our mind, our psyche defends itself by protecting you from emotions which have been deemed unsafe. Because your anger when you were a child wasn't allowed, so it's unsafe, it's pushed away. You weren't allowed to show your sadness and fear at school, so that's been pushed away as well. And then you've got to become slowly more and more aware of the ways you're resisting these reservoirs of emotional pain, because that's what needs to happen so that you can then start to take responsibility for it. And that's a biggie because the resistance and the repression is a massive deal and it can be very subtle and powerful. And it can also be life changing to realize that to start to free yourself up emotionally can be one of the most transformative things that can ever happen to you in a really positive way, challenging though it is. So, how do you become more emotionally mature? There are other videos I've shot that go more into this. How to feel your feelings is a good one. There's a video on repressed anger, which a lot of the structures and processes I talk about there apply to most emotions. And I have a video on how to get started with somatic work by yourself. So check out those videos. But in a nutshell, you really need to just gain the skills. It's practice and skill is what's needed here, right? Firstly, learning to connect to the body, to drop out of the mind, come more into the body, to discern what you're feeling. Then to be able to become more conscious of the ways in which your defense mechanisms operate, how you're resisting and repressing different emotions. And thirdly, gaining the skills, but practicing being more vulnerable and expressing your emotions, just expressing honestly what's there and learning how to feel them, which again, there's a whole bunch of separate skills there, um, which I do talk about in other videos. Ultimately, you also then need to engage with life. Life is what brings up emotions, and it's life that really changes and transforms you above all. So, as you're going through life and it's bringing up emotions, just practice becoming more vulnerable and honest and transparent and clean and clear with what you're feeling. It's a tough road, but it is so, so worth it. I do work with people one on one, helping them to do this kind of work. So, if this resonates with you, reach out to me. All the info is below, and get in touch, and we can see if I can help you. Bye.